Hello, my dear friend. Today I'm excited to share a story about learning secrets. This story is meant to inspire those of you who feel stuck in your English learning journey or who believe it's just too hard to reach fluency. Learning a new language, especially English, comes with its unique set of challenges. But what's more important is the process, how someone navigates through the ups and downs to succeed. Before we dive into Alex's personal story, I want to give you a full explanation. Learning a language isn't just about knowing words or understanding grammar rules. It's about developing a mindset, building habits, and finding what works for you personally. Some people may think learning is all about hours of study or memorization. But for Alex, it was more about consistency, curiosity, and making the learning fun. In this story, you'll hear about Alex's journey, how he struggled, what kept him motivated, and most importantly, the secret that finally unlocked his ability to speak and think in English. It's a simple secret, but one that made a world of difference. His story will show you that learning English is not just about sitting in front of books. It's about experiencing the language in a way that sticks with you forever. Now, let's get into the story of how Alex found his way to success. Hi, my name is Alex, and today I'm sharing my struggle to learn English. For the longest time, I thought it was impossible for me to speak fluently, to understand fast conversations, or even to watch movies without subtitles. But I did it. And guess what? It wasn't because I spent hours and hours cramming vocabulary lists or repeating grammar rules. No, it was something else. A learning secret that changed everything for me. I wasn't always bad at English, but I wasn't great either. In school, I passed my exams and did my homework, but something was missing. Every time I tried to speak, I froze. I felt like the words were stuck somewhere between my brain and my mouth. And you know that feeling when you understand what someone is saying, but your mind just won't form a response quickly enough? That was me all the time. So I started asking myself, what's wrong with me? Why can't I speak when I know the words? I'll never forget the moment that kicked off my journey. I was watching a movie, one of those action-packed ones with fast dialogue, and I realized I was completely lost. I couldn't follow the conversations and I felt so frustrated. That night, I made a decision. I had to change something, and I was determined to find out what. At first, I tried the usual methods: flashcards, online courses, apps. They were okay, but I still felt stuck. It was like I could remember a ton of words, but when it came to actually using them, my brain froze up, and I couldn't understand why. Then, one day, I had an idea. I thought, why don't I stop thinking of English as something I study and start thinking of it as something I live? Sounds weird, right? But that's where my secret began. I realized that I had to make English a part of my daily life, not just a subject in school or a task on my to-do list. Instead of treating English like homework, I started treating it like an adventure. I'll explain how it worked for me. I started with my daily routine. I thought, what if I do everything I usually do, but in English? So, when I woke up in the morning, instead of scrolling through my social media in my native language, I switched everything to English. My phone settings, my apps, everything. The first thing I did each morning was watch a short video in English. Not a grammar lesson or anything like that, just something fun or interesting. Sometimes it was a news clip, other times it was a YouTube vlog. The key was to make sure it was something I enjoyed. That way, it didn't feel like studying. It felt like I was just exploring something cool. And let me tell you, this small change made a huge difference. Suddenly, I was looking forward to learning English because it wasn't about memorizing. It was about understanding and having fun. Another big part of my secret was how I interacted with English throughout the day. I wasn't just watching videos or listening to podcasts. I started to think in English. Sounds strange, right? But here's how I did it. Every time I saw something around me, like a car, a tree, or even my breakfast, I tried to describe it in English. For example, if I was drinking coffee, I'd think to myself, this coffee is hot, a little bitter, and it wakes me up in the morning. Just simple thoughts like that, but in English. Slowly, it became natural to think in the language. I wasn't translating anymore in my head. I was just living the language. I remember one time when I was out with my friends, I started thinking in English without even realizing it. We were at a restaurant, and I was reading the menu. In my head, I started forming sentences like, I wonder if this dish is spicy. Maybe I'll try the pasta instead. It was a small moment, but it felt like a breakthrough. English was no longer just a subject. It was becoming part of my life. One of the best parts of my learning secret was connecting with people. I realized that the more I talked, the better I got. So I looked for every opportunity to speak in English, even if it was just a little bit each day. I found language partners online, joined group chats, and sometimes I even talked to myself in front of the mirror just to get more comfortable with speaking. At first, I was scared. What if I made mistakes? What if people didn't understand me? But then I thought, who cares? The only way I'm going to improve is by practicing. So I embraced the awkwardness and started talking. I made tons of mistakes, sure. But I also learned from them. The more I spoke, the more confident I became. I'll never forget one of my first real conversations in English. It was with a language partner from another country. We were talking about our favorite movies, and at one point, I realized I wasn't even thinking about the language anymore. I was just speaking. We laughed, we joked, and it felt amazing. That conversation gave me the confidence to keep going. The final part of my learning secret? Consistency. This is where a lot of people struggle. It's easy to get excited in the beginning, but after a while, the motivation fades. That happened to me too. There were days when I didn't feel like practicing or when I thought I wasn't making any progress. But here's what I did. I created small, easy habits that I could stick to every day. Even on days when I felt tired, I made sure to do at least one small thing in English. Whether it was listening to a song, reading a short article, or just thinking in English for a few minutes, I kept the momentum going. Little by little, those small actions added up. I know it might sound simple, but trust me, it works. If you approach learning with a mindset of curiosity and fun, instead of pressure and stress, everything changes. Let me give you a few more examples from my own experience. There were times when I made mistakes, lots of them. And I'm not talking about small ones. I once tried to order a coffee at an English-speaking cafe and ended up asking for a large laugh instead of a large latte. The barista gave me a confused look and I was so embarrassed. But you know what? I laughed it off. It's moments like those that you'll always remember, and they become part of the learning journey. The truth is, making mistakes is a part of the process. You can't be afraid of them. In fact, I started to look at my mistakes as lessons. Every time I messed up, it was just another step forward. I would think, okay, now I know not to say that next time. And gradually, I improved. One thing that really helped me improve my speaking skills was creating a routine around listening and responding in English. I started listening to English podcasts during my daily commute. Whether I was on the bus or walking, I'd have my headphones in, soaking in the language. The key was to find podcasts that were interesting to me, ones about travel, technology, or just funny stories. While I listened, I would pause and repeat what the speakers were saying. At first, it was hard. The native speakers talked so fast and I could barely keep up. But I stuck with it. Little by little, I started to understand more, and I could repeat entire sentences without stopping. Eventually, I didn't need to pause at all. I was able to respond in my head as if I was part of the conversation. Sometimes, I'd even imagine that I was having an actual conversation with the people in the podcast. I'd think of how I'd respond if I were talking to them face to face. It sounds silly, but it worked. It helped me practice thinking and speaking in real time, which made me more confident when I spoke to real people. Another breakthrough moment came when I decided to read books in English. I was never a big reader in my native language, so the thought of reading a book in English seemed impossible at first. But then, I found something that changed my perspective. I picked up a book that was easy to understand. Something light and fun, like a short mystery novel. I started reading just a few pages a day. In the beginning, I had to look up a lot of words, and it took me a while to finish even one chapter. But I didn't let that discourage me. I kept going. The more I read, the more familiar the language became. Eventually, I reached a point where I didn't need to translate every word. I could understand the meaning just by the context. That's when I realized that reading wasn't just about learning new words. It was about getting comfortable with the flow of the language. One day, I came across a book that was way above my level. Dense, full of complex vocabulary, and it looked intimidating. But instead of avoiding it, I saw it as a challenge. I decided to give it a try. It took me weeks to get through it, but by the end, I felt like I had climbed a mountain. It was hard, but I learned so much from the experience. Another important part of my learning journey was surrounding myself with English as much as possible. I didn't have the luxury of living in an English-speaking country, so I had to get creative. I started watching English TV shows without subtitles, listening to English songs, and even setting up my social media accounts in English. This was where things started to get interesting. I found that the more I surrounded myself with the language, the more natural it became for me. Even when I wasn't actively studying, I was still learning. I remember one time when I was watching a comedy show, and I started laughing at a joke. That's when I realized I didn't have to translate it in my head. I understood it in English. It was a small victory, but it meant a lot. That's the thing about learning. It's the little wins along the way that keep you going. One of the biggest lessons I've learned is that consistency is more important than intensity. You don't need to spend 5 hours a day studying English to make progress. In fact, it's much better to do a little bit every day than to study for long hours once a week. I made a commitment to myself. No matter how busy I was, I would spend at least 20 minutes a day practicing English. Sometimes that meant reading a few pages of a book. Other times it was watching a short video or writing down new words I had learned. The key was to keep the momentum going. I started small, but those small actions added up over time. As I continued my journey, I realized that learning isn't just about memorizing words and rules. It's about finding your own way of connecting with the language. Everyone has their own style of learning, and what works for one person might not work for another. For me, the secret was making English a part of my life, not just something I studied for an exam. It was about finding joy in the process, being patient with myself, and staying consistent. It took time and there were plenty of challenges along the way, but in the end, it was worth it. Today, I feel confident when I speak and I don't worry about making mistakes anymore. I still have a lot to learn, of course, but I've realized that learning is a lifelong journey, and that's okay. The most important thing is to keep going, to stay curious, and to never give up. So, if you're struggling with English, remember this. It's not about how fast you learn or how perfect you are. It's about enjoying the process, finding what works for you, and staying consistent. That's the real secret to learning. After sharing my learning secret, I want to emphasize something important. Progress isn't always visible day to day. There were many moments in my journey when I felt stuck, like I wasn't improving at all. But when I looked back after a few months, I realized how far I had come. One of those moments happened when I decided to test myself in a real-world situation. I wanted to see how well I could handle a conversation with someone I didn't know. So, I went to a cafe where I knew the barista spoke English, and I challenged myself to order entirely in English. I was nervous, my palms were sweaty, but I was determined to give it a try. When it was my turn, I walked up to the counter and said, "Hi, I'd like a cappuccino, please." It was simple, but it felt like such a big step for me. The barista asked, "Would you like any sugar with that?" Without missing a beat, I replied, "No, thank you." And that was it. I ordered my coffee in English, and it felt so natural. As I sat down with my cappuccino, I realized something important. Just a few months earlier, that same situation would have terrified me. I would have been too afraid of making a mistake or not understanding the barista's questions. But now I felt confident enough to not only speak, but to engage in a casual, everyday conversation. It was a small victory, but those are the moments that matter. Every little step you take, every time you use English in a real situation, you're making progress. It's not about being perfect. It's about trying, learning from your mistakes, and moving forward. Speaking of mistakes, I've made plenty along the way, but instead of seeing them as failures, I started viewing them as opportunities to grow. I remember one time I was talking to a friend who was a native English speaker, and I kept mixing up borrow and lend. I said something like, "Can you borrow me your pen?" My friend smiled and said, "You mean lend you my pen, right?" At first, I felt a little embarrassed. But then I thought, great. Now I know the difference. Instead of dwelling on the mistake, I learned from it. And that's the attitude I've tried to maintain throughout my journey. Mistakes are just part of the process, and the more you make, the more you learn. One thing that helped me a lot was keeping a journal. Every day, I would write down new words I learned, phrases I heard, and even some of the mistakes I made. I didn't write long entries, just quick notes to remind myself of what I'd learned that day. Over time, my journal became a record of my progress. Whenever I felt discouraged, I could flip through the pages and see how far I'd come. Another key part of my learning journey was surrounding myself with people who supported me. I didn't have many friends who spoke English, but I joined online communities where I could practice with others. We'd talk about everything: movies, food, travel, and it helped me get comfortable with speaking in a casual, relaxed way. One of the things I learned through those conversations is that fluency doesn't mean you have to know every word or never make a mistake. Fluency is about being able to express yourself clearly, even if you sometimes need to pause to think of the right word or rephrase something. It's about communication, not perfection. In fact, some of the best conversations I've had in English were the ones where I wasn't worried about making mistakes. I just focused on getting my message across, and I found that people were always understanding and supportive. Most people don't care if you mix up a word here or there. They're just happy that you're trying. One of the biggest challenges I faced during my journey was dealing with self-doubt. There were days when I questioned whether I'd ever be truly fluent. I'd see people who seemed to speak effortlessly, and I'd wonder, will I ever be like that? But over time, I realized that everyone has their own pace. There's no one right way to learn, and there's no deadline for fluency. I started to focus less on comparing myself to others and more on my own progress. I celebrated the small victories, like understanding a new phrase or having a smooth conversation. Those moments became the fuel that kept me going. And slowly but surely, I started to believe in myself more. One thing that helped me overcome my self-doubt was setting small, achievable goals. For example, I'd challenge myself to learn 5 new words each week or to watch a TV show without subtitles. Each time I reached one of these goals, it gave me a sense of accomplishment and motivated me to keep pushing forward. Now, looking back at my journey, I realized that learning a language is about so much more than just memorizing vocabulary or mastering grammar. It's about immersing yourself in the language and making it part of your everyday life. It's about enjoying the process, being patient with yourself, and finding your own unique way of learning. If I could give one piece of advice to anyone who's struggling to learn English, it would be this: don't give up. The journey might be long, and there will be challenges along the way, but every step you take brings you closer to your goal. Celebrate your progress, no matter how small, and remember that every mistake is an opportunity to learn. Learning a language isn't a race, it's an adventure. And like any adventure, there will be ups and downs, but the rewards are worth it. Today, I can confidently say that I'm comfortable speaking, listening, and even thinking in English. And that's something I never thought I'd be able to do when I first started. As I was saying, the journey doesn't really have an end. Learning, especially a language, is something you do for life. The moment you think you've mastered it all, there's always something new to discover. It could be a new slang word you've never heard, a different way of saying something, or even a cultural nuance that you didn't understand before. That's what makes it exciting. You're constantly growing. After gaining confidence with speaking and listening, I started to focus on the next challenge: writing. I knew that being able to speak fluently was one thing, but writing well was a whole different skill. At first, I was intimidated. Writing felt more formal, like I had to be perfect with my grammar and sentence structure. But just like with speaking, I knew I had to practice if I wanted to get better. I began by writing short, simple sentences. Things like, "Today I went to the store," or "I like to eat pizza." It felt a little silly, writing such basic sentences, but I knew it was necessary to build a strong foundation. Over time, I started to challenge myself by writing longer sentences and adding more detail. I'd write about my day, my thoughts, or something interesting I learned. One of the tricks I used to improve my writing was to read a lot of English content, especially blogs and articles written by native speakers. I paid attention to how they structured their sentences, how they used certain phrases, and how they expressed their ideas. Then, I'd try to mimic that style in my own writing. And just like with speaking, I wasn't afraid to make mistakes. I'd write something, and then I'd go back and check for errors. Sometimes I'd miss things, but that was okay. I found that the more I practiced, the more natural writing became. One day, I decided to take a big leap. I started writing a blog in English. It wasn't anything fancy, just a personal blog where I shared my thoughts on different topics, what I was learning, my hobbies, and even my experiences with learning English. It was scary at first because I knew people would be reading it. What if they judged my mistakes? What if they didn't understand what I was trying to say? But I reminded myself that this was all part of the journey. I wasn't writing to be perfect. I was writing to improve. And as I kept posting, something incredible happened. I started receiving comments from people around the world. Some of them were English learners like me, while others were native speakers who were just curious about my thoughts. Instead of criticizing my mistakes, people were supportive. They encouraged me, gave me helpful tips, and even shared their own stories about learning languages. That's when I realized something important. Learning a language isn't just about mastering grammar or pronunciation. It's about connecting with people. Language is a tool that brings us together, and it doesn't have to be perfect to be meaningful. As my writing improved, I started to tackle more complex topics. I wrote about my favorite books, movies, and even cultural differences between my country and English-speaking countries. Writing allowed me to express myself in ways that speaking couldn't always capture. I found that I could take my time to think about what I wanted to say and choose the right words to convey my thoughts. It wasn't just about learning new words or grammar rules. It was about learning how to express my ideas in a way that felt authentic. That's something that takes time, but it's one of the most rewarding parts of learning a new language. You're not just memorizing phrases. You're learning how to communicate your unique perspective with the world. One thing that really pushed me to keep improving was setting new challenges for myself. After starting my blog, I set a goal to write one post every week. Some weeks, I didn't feel like writing at all, but I forced myself to sit down and do it anyway. Even if the post wasn't perfect, I knew that every time I wrote something, I was getting better. Another challenge I set for myself was to participate in online discussions. I joined forums where people talked about topics I was interested in, things like technology, travel, and self-improvement. At first, I was hesitant to jump in because I didn't want to say something wrong or be misunderstood. But then I thought back to my experiences with speaking and reminded myself that the only way to improve was by practicing. So I started posting comments, sharing my thoughts, and asking questions. And just like with my blog, people were supportive. Sure, I made mistakes here and there, but I learned from them. More importantly, I was building confidence. Each time I joined a discussion, I felt a little more comfortable expressing myself. One of the greatest lessons I've learned from all of this is the importance of consistency. Whether it's speaking, writing, listening, or reading, the key is to keep at it, even when it feels difficult. It's easy to get discouraged when you don't see immediate results, but progress takes time. I didn't become fluent overnight. It took years of practice, mistakes, and small victories along the way. It's kind of like working out. You don't see the changes after just one day at the gym, but if you stick with it, you'll start to notice improvements over time. The same goes for learning English. If you practice a little bit every day, even if it's just for 10 or 15 minutes, you'll start to see progress. The important thing is to keep going, no matter what. Another thing that helped me was finding ways to make learning fun. Learning doesn't have to be a chore. It can be something you actually enjoy. For example, I started watching English language TV shows and movies with subtitles. Not only did I get to improve my listening skills, but I was also entertained. I'd watch comedies, action movies, documentaries, anything that interested me. It didn't feel like studying, but I was still learning. I also started playing video games in English. This might sound surprising, but games are a great way to practice language skills. Many games require you to read instructions, follow dialogues, or interact with other players in English. It was a fun and interactive way to immerse myself in the language without feeling like I was studying. One of the most valuable things I learned throughout this journey is the importance of having a growth mindset. What I mean by that is believing that you can always improve, no matter where you start. I used to think that being fluent in English was an impossible goal, something only a few people could achieve. But once I adopted a growth mindset, everything changed. Instead of thinking, I'll never be good at this, I started thinking, I'm getting better every day. Instead of focusing on my weaknesses, I celebrated my progress. And that shift in mindset made all the difference. It gave me the motivation to keep going, even when things got tough. To this day, I'm still learning. There are always new things to discover, new words to learn, and new ways to challenge myself. But that's what makes the journey exciting. It's not about reaching a final destination. It's about constantly growing, improving, and enjoying the process. So, my friend, if you're on your own language learning journey, I hope you'll take my story to heart. Remember that learning isn't a straight path. There will be ups and downs, moments of frustration, and moments of triumph. But as long as you keep going, you'll get there. And one last thing, don't forget to have fun along the way. Learning a language is an incredible adventure, and the more you enjoy it, the easier it becomes. Keep exploring, keep trying new things, and most importantly, keep believing in yourself. You've got this. And who knows, maybe one day, you'll be the one sharing your story with someone else who's just starting their own journey. As time passed, my confidence grew, and English started becoming less of a struggle and more of a natural part of my everyday life. I reached a point where I didn't have to think so much about the words before saying them. They just came out. But even then, I knew I couldn't stop. Language learning, as I've said before, is a never-ending journey, and I was determined to keep improving. One of the next challenges I set for myself was to engage in longer, more complex conversations. It's one thing to order a coffee or have a brief chat with someone, but it's a whole other thing to discuss deeper topics like philosophy, current events, or personal opinions. I wanted to reach the point where I could not only understand complex ideas, but also express my own thoughts clearly. I remember one day when I was hanging out with a friend who happened to be a native English speaker. We got into a discussion about personal growth and how people change over time. Normally, this kind of conversation would have intimidated me because it required not only good vocabulary, but also the ability to articulate abstract ideas. But this time, I was ready. I started explaining how I believed that growth wasn't linear, that people go through ups and downs, sometimes regressing before they can move forward. I used phrases like self-reflection and personal evolution, words that I had learned over the course of my studies. My friend listened intently, and as we went back and forth, I realized something incredible. I wasn't translating in my head anymore. I was thinking in English, forming my ideas directly in the language, without the middle step of translating from my native language. That moment felt like a breakthrough. I wasn't just speaking English anymore, I was using it to think, to explore ideas, and to connect with people on a deeper level. It was an amazing feeling. Of course, that didn't mean I stopped making mistakes. Far from it. Even during that conversation, there were a few times when I got stuck or couldn't find the right word. But by then, I had learned how to handle those moments. Instead of panicking, I'd just pause, think for a second, and either find a simpler way to say what I meant or ask for help. In fact, one of the most valuable lessons I've learned is that it's okay to ask for help. There's no shame in admitting you don't know something. If I didn't understand a word or phrase, I'd ask my friend to explain it to me. And if I couldn't find the right way to express myself, I'd ask them to help me rephrase it. More often than not, people are happy to help, and I found that those moments of vulnerability actually made our conversations stronger. I also started paying closer attention to cultural nuances, which is another important part of learning a language. It's not just about knowing the words and grammar, it's about understanding how people use the language in different contexts. For example, I noticed that English speakers often use idioms and expressions that don't make literal sense but are full of meaning. I remember the first time I heard the phrase, "spill the beans." At first, I was confused. What do beans have to do with anything? But then, my friend explained that it means to reveal a secret. These little phrases add color to the language, and understanding them makes conversations feel more natural and fluent. Over time, I started using idioms and expressions myself. I'd say things like, "it's a piece of cake" when something was easy, or "let's call it a day" when we were finished with something. It felt like I was finally blending into the rhythm of the language, becoming part of the flow. Another thing that helped me improve was diving into English literature. At first, I was hesitant to pick up a full-length book, thinking it would be too challenging. But I decided to start with something simple, short stories or books written for young adults. I found that reading was not only great for expanding my vocabulary, but it also helped me see how words and sentences were put together in a natural way. One of the first books I read was a classic, The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. The language was a bit old-fashioned at times, but the story itself was compelling, and I learned so much from it. I kept a dictionary nearby, and whenever I came across a word I didn't understand, I'd look it up and write it down in my journal. As I became more comfortable with reading, I started branching out into more complex books, novels, nonfiction, even poetry. Reading exposed me to different writing styles and gave me a deeper understanding of how language can be used to convey emotions, ideas, and even humor. At some point, I started to feel like English wasn't just something I was learning. It was becoming part of who I was. I noticed that I was starting to think in English more often, even when I wasn't speaking or writing. Sometimes I'd catch myself dreaming in English, or I'd find that my inner monologue had switched languages. It was an incredible realization, and it made me feel like I had truly integrated the language into my life. But even with all the progress I had made, I knew there was always more to learn. Language is constantly evolving, and there will always be new words, expressions, and nuances to pick up. That's one of the things I love about it. There's never a point where you can say, "I'm done." There's always something new to explore. Another thing that has kept me going is the sense of community I've found along the way. Whether it's through online forums, language exchange apps, or in-person conversations, I've met so many people who are also on their own language learning journeys. We share tips, encouragement, and even frustrations. It's comforting to know that I'm not alone in this process, and it's inspiring to see others succeed. One of my favorite experiences was participating in a language exchange program. I'd meet up with someone who was learning my native language, and we'd spend half the time speaking in English and the other half in my language. It was a great way to practice, and I learned so much from my language partners. They'd give me feedback on my English, and I'd help them with their pronunciation or grammar in return. It was a win-win. Looking back now, it's amazing to see how far I've come. From the boy who could barely string together a sentence to someone who can confidently hold deep conversations, write blog posts, and read entire books in English, it feels like a different world. But the best part is, I know the journey isn't over. There's still so much more to learn, and I'm excited for whatever comes next. Sometimes I think about how different my life would be if I hadn't pushed myself to learn English. I wouldn't have been able to connect with so many amazing people from around the world. I wouldn't have access to the vast amount of knowledge and resources available in English. And most importantly, I wouldn't have had the chance to grow in the way that I have. Learning a language isn't just about gaining a skill. It's about opening doors, expanding your horizons, and becoming a more confident, capable version of yourself. And that's something truly special. As I continue on this journey, I've set new goals for myself. I want to become even more fluent, to the point where I can discuss any topic with ease. I want to improve my writing so that I can write essays, articles, and maybe even a book one day. And I want to keep connecting with people, learning from them, and sharing what I've learned in return. And just like before, I know there will be challenges along the way. There will be moments of frustration, times when I feel like I'm not making progress, and situations where I make mistakes. But I've learned to embrace those moments because they're all part of the process. Each mistake is a lesson, each frustration is an opportunity to grow, and each challenge is a chance to become better. So here I am, still on the path, still learning, still growing. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that the journey never really ends. And that's the beauty of it. There's always more to explore, more to discover, and more to achieve. And to anyone else out there who's on their own language learning journey, I just want to say this: keep going. No matter how hard it feels, no matter how many times you stumble, you're making progress. Celebrate the small victories, learn from your mistakes, and remember that every step you take brings you closer to your goal. You've got this. Just keep pushing forward, and one day you'll look back and be amazed at how far you've come.